few days later, Mila and Nina were walking through the village when they overheard some children talking excitedly in the town square. "Did you hear? My shadow's gone," one of the children said, her eyes wide with fear. "Mine too," another child chimed in. "It's just gone. It's like it disappeared." The group of children stood together, whispering to one another. Mila's heart began to race. She had heard rumors before about missing shadows, but she never thought they were true. Could it be that Mr. Thorn had something to do with it? Mila turned to Nina. "What if Mr. Thorn is really the shadow catcher?" she whispered. "What if he's taking everyone's shadows?" Nina's eyes widened with excitement. "That would be so cool, but also kind of scary," she said with a grin. Mila frowned, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Thorn was involved somehow. After all, what else could explain the missing shadows? That evening, Mila and Nina sat by the fireplace, plotting their next move. They decided that they would find out the truth about Mr. Thorn once and for all. They would follow him and uncover what he was really doing with the missing shadows. "We need to be sneaky," Mila said, her voice low. "We can't let him see us." Nina nodded enthusiastically. "We'll be like secret agents." The girls spent the next few hours gathering what they thought they would need for their plan: a lantern, a rope, and a small mirror. They believed that the mirror might help them see something that wasn't visible to the naked eye. They weren't sure what exactly they would find, but they were determined to uncover the truth. The next morning, Mila and Nina set off early, their hearts pounding with excitement and fear. The fog was thick, covering the ground in a soft, white mist. It was just the kind of day that felt mysterious, like something hidden could be uncovered. The girls made their way through the woods, the tools they had gathered clutched tightly in their hands. They walked for what felt like hours, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath them. Mila couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, her mind racing with what they might find. Was Mr. Thorn really the shadow catcher? Or was he just a lonely old man who had been misunderstood all along? As they reached the edge of Mr. Thorn's property, Mila's heart skipped a beat. There, in the distance, she saw him. Mr. Thorn was standing by his house, bending down to tend to something in his garden. His back was to them, and for a moment, he seemed peaceful, almost gentle. "Do you think he knows we're here?" Nina whispered, her eyes wide with curiosity. Mila shook her head. "I don't know, but we need to be careful." They crouched behind a tree, watching Mr. Thorn as he worked. He wasn't doing anything strange. He was just picking vegetables from his garden and placing them into a basket. Nothing about his actions seemed unusual. Yet, in the back of Mila's mind, a nagging doubt remained. Could he really be the one causing the missing shadows? As the girls waited, they saw something that made their hearts race. A rabbit hopped out from behind a bush, followed by a hedgehog, and then a small fox with a limp. They were animals, but there was something special about them. They looked healthy, cared for, and, most surprisingly, they seemed to be following Mr. Thorne around. Mila's eyes widened in realization. Mr. Thorne wasn't a shadow catcher. He was taking care of these animals, saving them from harm. The missing shadows weren't caused by him. They were a coincidence, or perhaps something that the children had imagined. Mr. Thorne wasn't the villain. He was a quiet, kind man who helped those in need, whether they had fur or feathers. Mila's heart sank with guilt. How could she have believed such a scary story about him? She had feared him, watched him from a distance, and judged him without understanding. The whole time, he had been caring for animals, making sure they were safe and fed. "Let's go," Mila whispered to Nina, her voice full of regret. "We were wrong about him." Later that day, after the girls had returned to Grandpa Ben's cottage, Mila couldn't stop thinking about what they had seen. Mr. Thorne wasn't the shadow catcher from the old story. He was someone who had a heart full of kindness, even if he didn't show it in the same way others might. Mila knew she had to make things right. She couldn't let the mistake they had made stand. She turned to Nina, who was already picking flowers in the garden. "Nina, we have to go back and apologize to Mr. Thorne," Mila said firmly. "We were wrong. He's not what we thought." Nina looked up, her face lighting up with understanding. "You're right. We should take him something nice, like flowers or some food to say sorry." Together, the girls gathered a basket of freshly picked flowers, a loaf of bread from the kitchen, and some apples they had found in the garden. They set off toward Mr. Thorne's house, their hearts heavy with regret, but also filled with hope that they could make things right. When they arrived at Mr. Thorne's house, he was sitting outside, enjoying the peace of the quiet afternoon. He looked up as they approached, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Thorne," Mila began, her voice sincere, "we're really sorry for the way we acted. We thought you were, well, something you're not. We were wrong to be scared of you." Mr. Thorne raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "We brought you these," Mila said, holding out the basket of flowers and the loaf of bread. "We just wanted to say thank you for everything you do, and we're sorry for misunderstanding you." Mr. Thorne looked at the basket for a moment, his face softening. Slowly, he stood up and took the basket from Mila's hands. "You didn't need to bring me anything," he said in his gruff voice, but there was a warmth behind it that Mila hadn't noticed before. "But I appreciate it. It's not often I get visitors." Mila and Nina stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. Then, to their surprise, Mr. Thorne smiled, a small, quiet smile that lit up his face. "Would you like to meet my animals?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I think you'd like them." Mila's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected that, but she was more than happy to accept. "Yes, we'd love to," Mila replied, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. Mr. Thorne led them to the back of his house, where the animals were waiting. The rabbit, the hedgehog, and the fox were all there, playing together in a small pen he had made for them. Mr. Thorne knelt down, calling them by name, and they came over to him, nuzzling him with affection. "These are my friends," Mr. Thorne said, his voice soft as he petted the animals. "They keep me company, and I help them when they're hurt or in need." Mila and Nina watched in awe. It was hard to believe that this was the same man they had feared just days before. He wasn't a shadow catcher at all. He was a man who loved animals and cared for those who had nowhere else to go. "I'm sorry for not understanding you," Mila said quietly. "I'm glad we came to see the truth." Mr. Thorne smiled again, a little more warmly this time. "It's all right. People can be afraid of what they don't understand, but I'm glad you came to see who I really am." From that day on, Mila and Nina visited Mr. Thorne regularly. They brought him more food and flowers, and in return, Mr. Thorne shared stories about his life and his adventures. He told them about his time as a soldier, about the places he had traveled, and about the animals he had saved over the years. Slowly, the fear that had once surrounded him began to melt away, replaced by a genuine friendship. The other villagers, too, began to warm to Mr. Thorne. They saw him not as a strange, frightening man, but as a kind soul who simply wanted to live in peace and care for the creatures around him. The children who had once whispered about the missing shadows no longer believed in the stories they had heard. They came to visit Mr. Thorne and his animals, laughing and playing in his garden. Mila had learned an important lesson, that sometimes the things we fear the most are simply things we don't understand. She had been wrong about Mr. Thorne, but she was grateful that she had the chance to learn the truth. As for Mr. Thorne, he was no longer the mysterious figure lurking at the edge of the village. He had become a friend, a quiet, kind man with a heart full of love for the animals and the people around him. And so, life in the village returned to its peaceful rhythm. The trees in the forest continued to whisper in the wind. The animals played in the fields, and the people smiled at each other with warmth and understanding. Mila and Nina had learned that sometimes the scariest things are simply misunderstood, and that the truth is often much kinder than the stories we tell ourselves.